How does the saying go? One man's trash and the Java will take it and try to sell it back to you? Yeah, I think that's it. You see, here on the Sandcrawler, we have a huge pile of junk, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to find some gems in the middle of all this junk. So, come on this journey with me and find out exactly what is in Java's junk. And you see, this junk pile is supposed to be made up of games that are either somewhat obscure or games that are fading into obscurity. It doesn't mean that you haven't played it or isn't popular in some region of the world. It just means that, in my eyes, the game needs a little bit more attention. So, I'm going to start pulling stuff out of the pile, and we're going to decide if it should go on the shelf or if it should stay in the pile. So, let's start with what's on top of the pile. Let's see here. Battle Engine Aquila, made in 2003 by a company named Lost Toys. They only ever made 2 games before their company went under. Fun fact, Battle Engine Aquila actually almost was lost media because it was actually on abandonware for a very long time. And then somehow GOG was able to acquire it, and I think it's also on Steam now, so that's awesome, honestly. So when I went to go grab it off abandonware from the last time I saw it, I noticed that it moved to GOG, so I bought the GOG copy, and I'm really happy about that. Anytime one of these things moves to a storefront is actually important, because the longer it sits on sites like abandonware, the more chances that it has to actually disappear forever if something is to happen to the download link that's available to it. At least if it's on a storefront, a lot of people can buy the license to it, and especially on GOG, they can keep it forever, and they'll always be able to potentially hold on to it. Battle Engine Aquila is actually pretty impressive, especially considering what it did at the time in 2003, because it was on consoles. So in addition to the PC port, there's a PS2 port and an original Xbox port. I actually can believe this being on the original Xbox, but the one that kind of baffles me is the fact that it's on the original PlayStation 2. The reason I say this is because a lot of stuff is happening at all times on the screen. And not only that, but the individual units that are in the game, like the AI, is actually fighting each other. It's not like they're just window dressing. The actual AI that is on your side is actually also participating in the battle. Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What is this game actually about? In Battle Engine Aquila, you play as a mech that can transform into a flight mode and a walker mode. It's basically a spiced up formula of the classic arcade flight games that were popular in the 2000s era. Very similar to those kind of games back in the day. The gameplay is very simplistic because it's designed to basically give you a fast, easy to jump into experience. However, what it does do very well is how chaotic the battles are and how you can approach the objectives any way you want. The Aquila engine has about 4 different loadouts, and each one of them does something a little different. Like, for example, one of them is more focused on bombing runs and dogfighting, whereas the other ones are more focused on how your walker performs on the ground and what kind of weapons it has access to. Basically, there are different missions where you'll either focus more on the flight combat or the walker combat for the most part, and sometimes a mix of the two. But what I found is it kind of comes down to your preference. You can basically use different loadouts that you want to use for any situation, and you can make it work. Something else to keep in mind is that the weapons you have access to as a walker are different than the weapons you have access to as in flight mode. Your walker, for example, will usually have access to things that make it better at ground combat, but it can have some anti-air weapons. Whereas the flight mode is usually going to be focused on either bombing runs or dealing with dogfighting situations. My personal favorite loadout was the Lance variant, mostly because it has access to the beam cannon, which is basically like a continuous beam that fires until it overheats. However, there's a chance during combat that it'll augment, and when that happens, you can hold down your left mouse button. It'll target multiple enemies on the ground, and then it will fire off these laser blasts, and they usually decimate in like one shot most enemies, and it's pretty cool. I also like it thematically. You also get access to the torpedoes in flight mode, and these things can devastate ground objectives very easily, but even though they don't have homing properties, if you line them up and hit a flying unit, it'll knock most of them out really quickly as well. So that's my preferred one for every mission for the most part. But some of the other ones, like if it's really flight heavy, you might be better off using things like micro missiles. So every mission basically takes place on like a little island, and on that island you have objectives that usually pop up. You can approach them how you kind of want. The game will usually suggest to you how to handle them, but a lot of times you can actually finish missions very quickly if you just find the source of the problem. So for example, if they're telling you to defend the city from tanks or something, just find whatever's making the tanks, like if they're being dropped by a drop ship or a factory, and just blow it up, and that will solve all the problems, and the mission may end right then and there, because whatever other objectives that may have been planned for the mission will no longer matter because you already cleared out any threats. And you may say, Well, that makes the game too easy, so how is that going to be enjoyable? Well, here's the kicker. A lot of times in order to actually achieve this, you have to go away from whatever your current objective is. So for example, if the base that you're protecting is being attacked by tanks and you decide to go blow up whatever is making the tanks first, then what could happen is those tanks could overwhelm the base and destroy it, and then you lose the mission outright. So you are potentially sacrificing the base and losing the actual objective in the mission while you're trying to complete it faster. So you have to kind of like gauge whether or not the AI is going to be able to hold out, or if you need to clear some out before you go. It just wholly depends on that. So you kind of sometimes have to ping pong back and forth, because you got to make sure you're defending your objective, whatever it is, or assaulting whatever objective you're doing. But most of the time there's a give and take to the missions. You're always going to have to be doing some form of offense and defense. Honestly, one of the interesting things about the game is it kind of feels like an RTS, but instead of you being the commander, you're playing as one of the units. The reason I say that is because there's going to be a lot of units on your side, such as tanks, soldiers, ships, even bigger ships and frigates, even boats can be on your side, as well as the enemy side. The enemy is also going to have access to things like tanks, other walkers, ships, you name it. And during the whole time, most missions, both sides are going to have a base on the island, so you can choose to actually assault the enemy base even if it's not the objective, which plays into what I said earlier. Sometimes just blowing up their base will solve the entire mission right then and there. It's also interesting because, like I said, on most maps, even if the objective is never about a certain enemy or object that's being produced, the enemy and your team will continuously produce units on their bases unless something is done about it. So sometimes, even if your objective is, let's say, to defend a boat that's coming up the shore to release troops or whatever, sometimes destroying the enemy base can actually alleviate a lot of the difficulty because they're not able to spawn all these units anymore. I also like that you can kind of rely on the AI to kind of help you in situations. And what I mean by that is, let's say your forces encounter the enemy forces and they both have like a group of tanks and soldiers. They'll be fighting you out for a little bit, so you can either provide, air support or come down there and help, or you can go focus on another objective or enemy that you're wanting to take out before you come back and clear that up if it's necessary. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes if you, for example, clear the skies of all the fighters, then the fighter support that's in the sky will work on ground support, and then all of a sudden it makes it so much easier for you to focus on destroying the enemy base. So the overall battles are pretty impressive to me, and I like how everything matters on the map. Now, for how it actually feels to play though, I will say this: Battle Engine Aquila does have its problem in the sense that the Aquila engine itself doesn't necessarily feel great because it feels very floaty. It doesn't really feel like you're a walker when you're in walker mode. Like, you don't feel any heftiness or heaviness. You feel very quick and agile, same way you kind of do as a jet. But both speeds kind of seem very similar. Like, being on the ground versus actually flying around doesn't feel that different in a lot of ways. And it feels very floaty. And some of the weapons have some okay weight to them, but for the most part I feel like they're kind of floaty as well. And they don't have the impact you kind of want them to have. And I feel like that also kind of hurts it. Another weak point to it is the story. The story is there, but it's not very interesting. It basically plays out over several cutscenes as you play through the game. It's a short game, it's about 5 hours, and it's just a very typical sci-fi war story about, two factions fighting each other, and one faction is clearly like an evil empire, and the other one's, the good guys or whatever. Honestly, I barely paid attention to it. I tried, but it just wasn't interesting at all. And honestly, I don't think the game even cared about it to begin with. I feel like the game is all about the gameplay, which it does good for the most part. The game is not very long. It's actually like 5 hours long in total. If you want to sit down and beat it, you can do it in one little session. However, I think this is perfect. The game doesn't do too much, so you kind of see everything very quickly, and I feel like 5 hours is the perfect point to where it doesn't overstay its welcome. And I still find it's a very enjoyable game where you can just turn your brain off and just blow stuff up. Graphically speaking, I actually think the game looks quite well for its time, especially even now, considering it doesn't look bad at all. And I think because you're not really looking at character models outside of cutscenes, I think it kind of helps it a lot as well to kind of sell you the point that you're not really playing something as old as it is. I will say though that within a couple hours you will have seen it all. The game takes place over several islands, but all the islands are reused a lot, and the game takes place on basically either a snow island in the middle of the ocean or maybe some tropical island. It doesn't really change too much, and the environment itself and the maps will be easy to recognize the more you play them, so there isn't too much variety there in my opinion. Furthermore, if you're going to play the PC copy, you're going to need the widescreen fix, otherwise it won't play in widescreen. But other than that, you don't really need to do anything else to get the game running fine. It actually still runs pretty fine on modern systems. I will link in the description to the widescreen fix. It took me a while to actually find it. A lot of the websites that used to have it don't have it anymore, but I did find it. And I do have it saved on my computer in case something happens to it, and I'll find a way to upload it somewhere else. But for now, you can get it at the link below. And that's pretty much Battle Engine Aquila. It's not a long game, like I said, and there isn't too much to be said. It's mostly focused on the actual gameplay. And I will say this, I really did enjoy it. It's actually a very interesting game. I played it back in the day when I was younger, so I did kind of remember it, and it kind of sat in the back of my head for a very long time. Every now and then I would think about it and be like, man, that game where you could transform into a mech and a flying jet was pretty cool. But, you know, now that I've played it again, I'd still say it's pretty cool. It's a fun concept. So the real question is, does it go back in the junk pile or does it go on the shelf? I'm going to say shelf. I think Battle Engine Aquila is pretty unique enough that it's worth playing, especially because you can get it for a couple dollars on GOG. And I do recommend it. It is an interesting experience and it's a good way to kill 5 hours. And that has been my little retrospective on Battle Engine Aquila. If you want to see anything else, let me know. I will definitely like to feature it on Jawa's Junk. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. If you like what you saw, please subscribe and you have a good rest of your day. Take care and I'll see you on the next one.